Okay.
All right, so we'll just get started. So welcome everybody to Researching Happy. Today we are thrilled to have Professor Sarah Willen joining us to tackle this provocative question that we've covered off, I think, in lots of different ways throughout the episode so far of the show. Who gets to define flourishing? So Sarah is a medical and psychological anthropologist and co-director of the research program on global health and human rights at the University of Connecticut, renowned for her groundbreaking work on health equality and the structural barriers to flourishing. So Sarah, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. And I can just tell we're going to have a really fun conversation, basically, based on a lot of the work of yours that I've been reading. But it would be great to sort of start with a bit about yourself and your career journey to date. But just to put this in context, I guess I've on the show been really focused on getting different perspectives from different disciplines on, what is happiness, what is mental well-being and these sorts of things. So I think you're the first anthropologist, or I'm sure you're the first anthropologist on the show. So I'd love to hear a bit about the types of work that you do as an anthropologist and the way that you see the world. So I think you told me offline that they're kind of a strange bunch, or I think you said strange or weird, I don't know. I hope you said one of those things. So yeah, please tell us about yourself.
Sure. I'm happy to. Sometimes we're strange, sometimes we're odd. I think we're probably, in the context of this conversation, suspicious of the weird, in the, sort of conventionalized way. And that's perhaps one of our hallmarks, that we really try to think about the world, think about questions of, particularly for medical and psychological anthropologists like myself, to think about health and illness through lenses that are not rooted in Western, what we sometimes talk about as Western settings. So
Sure.
that's something I hope I can bring to our conversation a bit today. So I trained as a medical and psychological anthropologist, and I also have a background in public health, which informs a good amount of my work, and including some of the work that we'll talk about in our conversation today. So I would say, in terms of the theme or the broad focus of my work, I'm interested in the ways in which structural circumstances affect people's opportunities to live healthy, flourishing, meaningful, dignified lives. So I'm always thinking about that intersection between individual subjective experience and the larger contexts in which we live. So in terms of specific topics, I trained at Emory University. Interestingly, did not overlap with a very important scholar in your work, Corey Keyes. His building was his office was one building over, but we never managed to
There
cross
you go.
paths. So that's to my loss. But I trained in medical anthropology at Emory, and I also did my master's in public health there. And then I went on to spend a couple of years as a postdoctoral fellow in program in culture and mental health at Harvard Medical School, where I really hung out with medical anthropologists, psychological anthropologists, and psychiatrists, and began to think in pretty substantive ways about how anthropology can both inform the practice of mental health care and other forms of health care, and also bring kind of a critical lens to the kinds of concepts and practices that shape the training of clinicians and the
Hmm.
practice that happen in clinical encounters. My work topically or empirically has ranged across a number of different topics. My first big project involved about 2 decades of work with people living as illegalized migrants on the margins of Israeli society. So I lived in Tel Aviv, and I worked with West African and Filipino migrant workers. And that's where I began thinking about the kinds of questions of flourishing and what's necessary to flourish and what supports flourishing or impedes flourishing, that led to some of the more recent work that we'll talk about today. So I think I'll stop there, since that's probably a good solid grounding of both where I've come from and what anthropology might bring to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you feel no need to stop talking. That was great. I'm more than happy just to sit here and listen, to be honest. I'm just thinking we actually have lots to talk about, I think, because, some of our work, I've mentioned it on the podcast before, that we are funded to deliver like a wellbeing intervention for people living with a terminal cancer called multiple myeloma. And we have a PhD candidate working on the project, and she's bringing this really interesting lens of the unmet needs of people living with this condition. And it's a funny, not funny, but it's a unique circumstance, this cancer, because it is terminal. So once you get that diagnosis, you're on treatment for the rest of your life, but you do live for, often, 5 years or 10 years. And it's often sort of onset is in older age. But what she's finding, Natalie Tuckey, shout out to Nat, is that clinicians are so hesitant to refer to palliative care. And I
Mm,
think because what we're sort of asking in this research program is, can you flourish in dying, basically, in a sense? And here, like, as I was hearing what you were saying about the sort of the medical model and sort of putting an anthropological lens to the way that training occurs, there is these really interesting questions about this this clin this health professionals preference, I guess, to just continually treat, to give hope, to give options, when
mhm.
actually you can be doing both that and thinking about preparation for death, but that doesn't seem to be part of the medical training to date.
Yeah, and this is precisely the sort of thing that an anthropologist can really sit with and think with in ways that can perhaps, I mean, I would argue that absolutely can be helpful to people training clinicians, not just doctors, but nurses and other people involved in care settings. So, here's where an anthropologist would say so. And I actually supervised a wonderful doctoral student who just defended this spring, Megan Alexander, who wrote her dissertation on death doulas. So this is,
Ah,
I don't know whether you're familiar with the concept, but these are people who are sort of parallel to birth doulas, who are paraprofessionals. They're not formal clinicians, but their role is really to bring a model of late life, end of life that focuses specifically on the sorts of things that you're calling attention to. They're in part because they're not kind of captured by the logic of medicine that says we always have to take a heroic action. That, the role of the doctor is to save life. The role of the doctor is to be the hero who comes in and brings the solution. The role of the doctor is to be in a one-on-one kind of relation with the patient. Someone who's either trained differently or perhaps has a different role, like a death doula, can come in and say, what are the needs of this person? If we think about the experience of this particular person under the circumstances that they're facing, which may be profoundly challenging, adverse, moving toward the last stage of life, what is it that they would need in order to be in a place of that I think could be very useful in working with patients with multiple myeloma, among other conditions. And Megan's taught me a lot through her work with death doulas on just this topic.
yeah, thank you. So, all right, we're back. We had a little bit of technical difficulty there, so that's completely fine, and we're reliant on shaky internet around the world to bring these conversations to you. So thank you for your patience, Sarah. And so very fascinating. And I think people will hear this and think that, I was I would say I was such a naive student. I remember my wife going through psychology at university and talking about what she was learning in some anthropology topics and just thinking like, man, I don't get this. Like, I don't get what's the point of any of this stuff that you're talking about. It was like the anthropology of gift giving. If
Mm,
I remember, like this was like 15 years ago.
classic stuff.
Yeah, yeah. But at the
Still love.
time, I was just so naive. I mean, I think I made every wrong decision at uni, to be honest, but based on my own dumb opinion. And now, like, it just ironically looking back now, it's like, this is the most fascinating stuff and it's totally missed.
Well, I think you're doing just fine. But I would say the gift giving stuff is fundamentally about social relationships. It's about building connections and sustaining connections over time. And, that's pretty fundamental to the sorts of things you think about. So, yeah, we've
Yeah.
our value. We might
Yeah.
look odd at first, but we've got stuff to say.
Very good. Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking back then, but anyway, that's part of growing up. The how much does anthropology overlap with kind of the well-being world or the positive psychology world? Where does it sort of sit? Is there a big movement to think about these things, or is it kind of always been there and maybe overlooked by the pos psych world?
That's a really good question. And I have to kind of take a breath to think about the best way to answer. The simple answer is that the kinds of questions that are of urgent concern to folks in the world of positive psychology are kind of off the radar for most medical anthropologists, psychological anthropologists. We're not really engaging with the same kinds of questions that I've been reading about and learning about as I've been reading in this literature. And that's kind of, it sort of points to a consideration I wanted to bring to this conversation, which is the fact that I've been working on the topic of flourishing in various ways for about 10 years now. But I'm doing it not really in conversation with my colleagues in anthropology. I've been doing it largely in conversation with folks closer to your intellectual spheres. And it's been a little bit accidental and deeply fascinating and also really challenging because I've had to read pretty widely outside of my own field in order to even get a foothold in the conversation. And I'm coming, and this is another sort of hallmark of anthropology that I alluded to a bit earlier, I'm coming really with a fairly strong critique of some of the things that I've seen happening in the conversation. And it's really an outgrowth of our anthropological disposition to look at concepts and ask, is this concept doing the kind of work that needs to be happening right now? It's certainly doing work. Where is that work taking us? And is it perhaps taking us in a direction that might not be optimal, that might have some embedded red flags that folks aren't really seeing or acknowledging or willing to talk about? So I'm coming, out of my own space of intellectual comfort into a new realm, saying critical things. That's a pretty bold move. And I'm fully aware of that. And so I come to this with a good amount of humility and an awareness of the fact that I may be saying stuff that is just off base and wrong. But I genuinely do bring into this conversation about well-being and flourishing some insights that have really been baked into my intellectual hardwiring as someone who sits at that intersection of medical anthropology and public health. And I imagine we'll get there in the conversation. To sort of return to your question, certainly in anthropology, we think about what people in a particular sociocultural and sociopolitical setting see as what it means to live a life of well-being, a meaningful life, a dignified life. But the framing is not necessarily in the terms that are of greatest interest to people in psychology or that are circulating in the larger conversations that I've been reading into a bit about well-being. So there's certainly overlap substantively, not as much conceptually, that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a thing that I grapple with, and I had lots of conversations at the latest conference, which was in Brisbane, about this issue of, are we starting on the back foot because we're called positive psychology? Lots of people, including myself, don't know whether to associate with that field because of many of the limitations that it has. And the best work seems to be either multidisciplinary or actually not psychological, basically, around the world. And so this is a really interesting conversation, and your critiques are very welcome on this podcast, basically. So, I know I'm going so off track, and I apologize for that, Sarah. But one of the keynote presentations at the conference was by Robert Biswas-Diener, and it was about hospitality and well-being, and going back to the gift-giving kind of idea, this idea that, I guess what he was bringing was this invitation to think more broadly than the work that's happened so far in the positive psychology world, and look to, basically like human, I was going to say universals, but I know we're going to go into that topic in a minute, so that might be interesting. But this idea of like, what is human? What is something that cross-culturally has been so valued? This idea of hospitality. How do you welcome others into a space, into your space? And I imagine that anthropology would be all over that. And we, as the pos psych world, have just kind of missed it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't want to jump the gun and get into the universals question too soon, but I will say that, in anthropology, there was a very strong push toward what we often talk about as cultural relativism, kind of rejection of the idea that any sort of human universals might exist. And then there are some in our field who pulled back in another direction. And one of them is actually originally from New Zealand, an anthropologist named Michael Jackson, who's been in Europe and in the US for many decades now. And he writes from what we talk about as the tradition of existential anthropology or phenomenological anthropology. And he's one of those who's really pushed us to recognize that there do indeed seem to be certain dimensions of human experience that are very deeply rooted and quite common across many, many, many cultures. If we want to talk about them as universals, fine. Will they apply to every single human? No, will they apply to every single cultural group? Perhaps not. But there's still value in recognizing, for instance, the push and pull involved in hospitality. Now, what it will look like, what the expectations will be, how one will be made to feel or not feel welcome will certainly vary in many, many different ways. But that fundamental dimension of connectedness in some kind of tension occurs very, very frequently across human cultural settings. And, the notion of reciprocity is related to hospitality, but a bit different. And also um, a kind of fundamental tension or dynamic that shapes human relations in ways that have bearing on whether we feel okay or not, whether we feel seen or not, whether we are capable of describing ourselves as living in a state of flourishing or
Hmm.
well-being.
Hmm. Yeah. All right. Very cool. So thank you so much. So I'll get back on track now. Apologies for the many deviations, and I won't promise to not deviate in the future. But I really came across so much of your work in the critical conversations that you were publishing on, and really, which I so appreciate, I guess, is bringing, like you've said, a critical lens to some of the things that are basically accepted sight unseen in the well-being space. And it is just, thank you for doing that. Firstly, this idea of publishing commentary articles on big papers, being critical. And, in particular, I think of some of Tyler Vanderweel's work. And critical sounds negative, right? But I think it is just actually bringing a critical lens, thinking about it in a different way. And I think to his credit, I don't know Tyler, but to his credit, he responded and interacted with some of those ideas, you know, maybe for better or worse, I don't know, you can tell us. But I really, someone like on the other side of the world who watches this interaction, in the podcast land, I wish it would go faster. Like a phone call would have actually been pretty cool, but so valuable to see these different insights and how they interact.
Yeah, and I will say, I read Vanderweel's 2017 paper, and it's interesting. I went back to see how frequently it had been cited in relation to other papers that had a kind of solid definition of flourishing. I cited some Google Scholar stats in the introduction to the special issue that came out in Social Science and Medicine Mental Health in 2022. And at that point, it had been cited, 250 times. And the other kind of big leading papers were cited many thousands of times. And I checked today, he's up to about 1,400. So it's certainly gotten attention in the
Yeah.
past 5 years or so. But I read that piece and I found it fascinating because he was engaging with this concept of flourishing, which I had been working on in some of my work with migrants living on the margins, and then again in a project based in the U.S. that was a collaboration with a political scientist and another anthropologist, a mixed methods, multi-phase study looking at Americans' conceptions of deservingness and health. So I had been thinking a lot about flourishing, and my approach was very different from what I saw finding expression in this particular piece. And I still have the original PDF where I marked it up. I probably read it 3 or 4 times, each time marking it up in a different color with a lot of emotion, a lot of strong, a lot of bold marginal comments, because there were pieces of the argument that didn't sit well with me, that didn't sit well with my anthropological sensibilities, that didn't sit well with my public health training, that later I found didn't sit as well with the kind of methodological thinking that my political science colleague, Abby Fisher-Williamson, brought to our team in the work that was published in that special issue in 2022. So it's taken me a number of years to sort of sort out what it was that I wanted to say. And I have to say, I mentioned earlier that writing some of these critical pieces has been really challenging, and in large part because I'm stretching outside of my comfort zone. And it's taken a lot of reading and a lot of thinking to be able to articulate what it is I thought an anthropological voice might contribute of value, like you're suggesting, not to be in an unkind or knee-jerk sort of way, but really to try and enrich a conversation
Mhm.
that I could sense was moving very quickly, right?
Yeah.
Vanderweel leads a study that's very large, ordinarily well-funded compared to pretty much,
Anything ever.
your words.
Yeah. I mean, that's like a fact.
Yeah, it's like a $43 million study with operating in 22 countries with an N of over 200,000 participants. It's a massive study, and it was clear that it was going to generate huge amounts of data, huge numbers of papers. And even in reading that first piece, it was clear that there were some core assumptions that just didn't align with the way I was trained to think. And so what I've seen as my role has been to, in framing the collection in the language of critical dialogue and really an invitation to critical dialogue. I think my intentions have been very genuine, and my collaborators also have sought to really invite conversation, not to throw stones. And to Vanderweel's credit, he did invite me to come and speak to his group, and we had a conversation in which I shared some of my core concerns, and we had a little bit of conversation. And so there's been conversation and
Oh,
dialogue
that's cool.
in a spirit of generosity, which I appreciate very much. I've been in touch with some of the other colleagues on the team. So I do see a conversation unfolding here. Certainly, there's an elephant and a mosquito, and I am not the elephant. But I think, in this strange world of academic scholarship, it's really rewarding to be able to say, okay, somewhere with an idea can publish that idea and be able to actually spark a conversation. I think
Yeah.
that's rewarding for people doing podcasts on topics like this, for people all over the world. So I think just in that itself, there's something interesting and of value for those of us who want to think deeply about what it means, both to conceptualize well-being or flourishing, and then to try and think about what sorts of policy changes might support it or promote
Hmm.
it.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. And glad to hear that these conversations are ongoing, out of the world of, because like I said, from the other side of the world, you're reading these papers, you sort of see the forwards and backwards, and you hope that there's more conversation happening and things will come from this. So glad to hear that you were able, I mean, you're basically neighbors as well, right? In terms of like geographically, you're not too far from each other.
That is true. That is true. Yes. There's also a network that the Human Flourishing program has developed of scholars, and I'm sure I know you've interviewed some folks who've been part of that network on the podcast. And so there's a group focusing on justice and flourishing that I've
Mhm.
had the privilege of getting to know a little bit lately, and we're having some exciting conversations as well.
Very
Certainly
cool.
conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's awesome. I'm really excited to see what comes out of that team. So very cool. And so, the theme, I guess, of this conversation and of that conversation is who gets to define flourishing. I love the title. I think I've, sort of grown up in this world where we started in our work, as I mentioned to you offline, Sarah, that, we were really about sort of promoting this new idea of mental well-being into the community. And we started with PERMA, basically. So, Seligman's model. And that's because it was early days and because our state invited Seligman to South Australia as what this program called this Thinker in Residence program. And I think I've told this story on the podcast before, but basically he came and wrote a report saying like, here's what you could do if you wanted to talk about, mental well-being in this state, being like a relatively smaller state in Australia. So quite easy to get things moving. And that was about, disseminating the idea that there's this thing called mental well-being and here's the kind of the building blocks. But that really wasn't, our experience was that was quite effective at sort of helping people to understand this idea quickly and, in primary schools, aged care and everything in between. But it really didn't have much cut through with clinicians and
Mm-hmm.
psychologists and or public health. And so that's where we sort of were, I guess, invited to think more deeply about this and came across, Corey Keyes's work, which was much more robust, much more justified in its
Mm-hmm.
decisions and have sort of been moving in that space ever since. But there are lots of assumptions, I guess, even in that work. And this idea of who gets to define flourishing is just so important, because there are these questions of, are these models, at the end of the day, they are models, they're not absolute truth. Are these models useful? Are they useful across cultures? Are they useful across demographics? These sorts of questions. And I don't think they've really been, that hasn't been answered necessarily. So you've called for this sort of a critical anthropology of flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I guess the question that I've posed to you is how can we reimagine well-being or well-being research to avoid the pitfalls of these universalizing frameworks and sort of truly serve diverse communities around the world.
Yeah, and I appreciate the question very much. And I also appreciate the context you're offering for the question in the particular Australian context that you're most familiar with. And I think one point that's important to me to get across in today's
Please, yeah.
conversation the question of framing, right? So are we framing well-being, or are we framing flourishing as principally a mental health question? Or are we framing it as a question that involves a broader, more holistic sense of well-being? And if we're taking that broader, more holistic definition or approach, then it's necessary to think outside the mental health box, which means we have to talk to people who aren't in the mental health field. We have to talk to people who are in other policy spheres and
Hmm.
other policy realms. So I can see how, folks in public health would bristle at the idea that the solution to a problem with holistic dimensions is a mental health solution, right? And I think sometimes, and of course, this isn't particular to positive psychologists or to psychologists, but when we have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right?
Hmm.
And I think that this is part of the problem. In public health, we tend to talk about looking upstream, right? We want to think about what are the root causes of a particular phenomenon, of a particular problem. And sometimes that means we need to think with history. Sometimes it thinks we have to think with legacies of power and injustice, past and present, as they impress themselves upon people over the developmental life course. We have to think about things like intergenerational trauma. We have to think about things like the built environment, right? And the
Hmm.
ways in which urban planning and architecture shape the space, the very physical material spaces in which people live and work and play and all that good stuff. So, I think by calling for sort of anthropological approach to thinking about well-being and flourishing, what I'm really trying to do is braid together the kinds of psychological questions that lead toward solutions that ask people to see themselves differently, to see their opportunities differently, their challenges, their limitations, their opportunities, their capacity to develop new skills, right? Certainly that all matters. People have agency. This is one of the kind of bones that the Vanderbilt team has picked with me, sort of suggesting that we're arguing that it's all structure. No, of course not. We are individuals who have profoundly particular experiences of our own lived experiences and personal inclinations, right? And at the same time, we live in spaces and in places and in particular moments in time and in particular families and in particular communities. And all of those things will impress themselves upon us in ways that might support our reaching our potential, or they might impinge upon our capacity to reach our potential. And that sort of invitation to think about the interplay between structure and agency, bringing in a really strong sort of public health attention to root causes is what I would like to argue is necessary in
Hmm.
thinking about well-being and flourishing. To say that we need more people at the table, more, we could think about it as academic disciplines, or we can think about it as policy voices and academic disciplines. And this is where the anthropological voice perhaps is strongest. We need to talk to people who are trying to, or who would like to have greater well-being, who would like
Yeah.
to flourish, but are being obstructed, and listen to them, because they're going to have a lot to tell us that will be more resonant and probably more useful than what a bunch of people sitting at their desks looking down from 30,000 feet will have to say. So those are sort of the elements that I think are crucial if we want to draw an anthropological sensibility
Yeah.
into thinking
Yeah.
about the promotion of well-being or flourishing.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And that is, it's a funny topic because it has such history. Just the word flourishing, it has such rich history that it's almost
Mhm.
like I wish we'd called it something else. I think I often talk about mental well-being to
Yeah.
say, this is in the context basically of a psychological construct to differentiate between what is flourishing. I know different people have differentiated them differently, but do you have a preference when you're talking about flourishing? Are you talking about sort of the whole of life person within their life context? I'm assuming.
Yeah, I would say, here's how I'd put it. I'm very happy to speak with clinicians about the task that they face in
Okay.
providing care to individual people, which involves certain kinds of constraint. And that's a different conversation than the conversation about what we ought to be doing at a policy level to try and create the circumstances within a larger community of people will have the opportunity
Hmm.
to experience well-being.
Hmm.
So I have tended in the work that I think has brought us into this conversation today to focus on flourishing and how flourishing has been defined and conceptualized and how it's been distinguished between, or how distinctions have been drawn between flourishing and other similar concepts like happiness and well-being. So yeah, so I have tended to focus on the idea of flourishing and how it's moved, and the stakes of putting out a particular definition, arguing for a particular operational definition of that term, and then proposing policy shifts or policy changes, and also in some contexts, clinical level changes that build on the implementation and deployment of that particular definition. So I would say I've got a lot to say to and about nourishing, and probably less to and about well-being. And I've been using them sort of interchangeably,
Yeah.
picking up on your lead, I think. But I will say, in part, I'm trying to hew closely to that distinction because I haven't, in empirical terms, gone out and asked people, do you experience well-being? What does that mean to you? But I have done empirical research in which, my team and I went out and asked almost 170 people, would you describe yourselves as flourishing at this point in your life? Why or why not? What's helped you? What's gotten in the way? So I have lots to say with that data, and I don't have data on the well-being question,
Yeah.
which is
Okay.
why I'm trying to be a little careful. But I'm happy to talk about it if we're clear about our terms.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. And I'll probably just continue to mix up the terms. So apologies. And you can just call me out if I do that. But it is funny that I don't want to jump the gun, but if I was to be asked, I think, are you flourishing? I think my answer would sound a lot like if you'd asked me, am I satisfied with my life? I'm
Mhm.
wondering, but that's maybe just me. So, all right, I'll just slow my way into this. So I'd love to hear from you. You've mentioned, and I've seen some of your work was by the sounds of it, when you were living in Tel Aviv, trying to understand local understandings of flourishing and how
Mhm.
that might have brushed up against these sort of universals of a well-being model. And I think I'd love to hear, I'm imagining people would be listening to this and say, all right, something like PERMA, or obviously the mental health continuum short form like Keyes's model, there are they're quite universal, is what I would say. Nothing is fully universal. They're quite universal. Obviously, this idea of, let's just say PERMA is an easier one, although it's not my preferred model. Positive emotion, that's kind of universally important. How you get there is quite contextual, and for the rest of the letters as well. Like, where do you sit on that kind of statement when I say they're pretty universal, but how they applied is unique? Am I just already making the wrong step?
I guess, again, my question would be, what are we trying to accomplish, right? Are we trying to understand people's experience? If we're trying principally to understand people's experience, then I think we need qualitative tools and open-ended questions.
Yeah.
And that's certainly relevant in anthropological research and in a clinical space, right? If you're doing talk therapy, then the questions have to sort of open up opportunities for people to take you wherever they're going to go, wherever they need to go in exploring whether they are or aren't experiencing well-being or
Mm-hmm.
flourishing, or what you
Mm-hmm.
want to call it. If our question is, how do we understand or how do we make decisions about where to invest resources at a policy level in order to ensure that the greatest number of people are going to be able to experience well-being?
Mm-hmm.
We're asking a very different kind of question. The stakes are very different. The terms are very different. The participants in the conversation are you've got a different cast of characters. And so then we're really talking about something quite different. Now, in the middle are the scholars defining terms and using models and collecting data. And this is where I think it's important to think about how the data we collect is going to feed into the policy conversations. Because there, I can't just say, well, we need open-ended questions and we need to think qualitatively, and right. That's where my insistence on what we think of in anthropology as ethnographic methods falls a little bit short. Um, so that's where I feel like my voice as an anthropologist is to say, okay, we have these different models, and yes, there's value in trying to figure out which is going to do the best job of capturing what it is we need to know in order to do the policy work. And at the same time, there's value in asking ourselves what we lose when we measure. or what we
Yeah.
lose when we try to measure? What is sacrifice in the work of trying to measure itself? Um, and a lot of people doing quantitative research will say, yeah, whatever. Okay, fine. Ask that question and then let's move on. Okay, that's fine. Do your thing. But I really think that when we ask ourselves this question, but it gives us an opportunity to recognize the limitations of our disciplinary horizon. And that's what I want to offer here, right? I think if we recognize that choosing among, the different models available, whether it's Keyes or, Rife or Seligman or Vanderweel, in choosing among the available options, we're already narrowing the horizon of possibility and we're setting certain possibilities or certain potential elements of the conversation aside. And what I see as worrisome is that the models that are out there, and this is sort of what we argued in our empirical piece in the 2022 Social Science and Medicine Mental Health collection, is that the questions of power and equity or inequity are not really accounted for in these models. History is not really accounted for in these models. The structural considerations are not really accounted for. And so that's what brings me to the question of who gets to do the defining. Because if the defining is done by people whose lives are already buffered from a lot of crap that happens in the world, then they're going to come up with models that are going to measure experiences of life that don't include all of that crap. If adversity is outside of your frame, then you can't account for it in your measurement. And what we saw in the it's a small study, 170 people. It's not 200,000 people, but qualitative interviews of an hour and a half with people, you really get to listen to them talk about what it is that shapes the conditions of their life. And when significant numbers of people, like 70% of the people you're talking to point to structural and material circumstances as having a significant impact on their flourishing or capacity to flourish. That says to me something really significant is missing from the conversation. And you can do all of the skill building and all of the cultivating character and all of the, individual level intervention you want to do. But if people can't put a roof over their heads and they can't feed their children, what are we even doing? Which again, to me says it's not that the measuring itself isn't valuable. It's that if you want to affect change at the population level, you need to think about changes that have to happen at the societal level that will make it possible for people to meet those basic needs in order for them to be able to benefit from the kinds of individual level interventions that are being promoted. Does that make sense?
Does, yeah, thank you. And I appreciate your the distinction between, you've got measurement in the middle, you've got what that measurement would imply for individuals and the way that they support others, and the way then that the measurement will then inform policy. And they're quite two different options is I'm with you here. And so I think because, a lot of like I do have a bias towards individual level interventions. That's the type of work that we do. My sense is that I kind of probably go a different way, which is thinking about how they're poorly implemented, basically. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you're sort of saying, the classic examples, walking into a group of whatever, like a homeless shelter, for example, and saying, yes, so we're going to practice gratitude today, and this is going to fix all your problems. That's, in my mind, like just a silly thing to do, but it's poorly implemented, basically, as a psychological intervention, because
Can
it's
I?
not, yeah.
So here's my question to you. Where's the poor implementation? Because it's a poor match between the intervention and the setting, or?
It's a poor match to the intervention in the setting, but it's a poor understanding of almost like the logic model of what is happening in that person's life. So if we have a logic model which says, here are the outcomes I want for this person, here are the things that are happening in their life, and here's the way that I'm going to basically adjust the issues that are happening here for this person, gratitude is probably not the way to bring those two things together. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
It totally makes sense. I guess I'm seeing so many it's a great model to think with because it's so problematic. But I guess what you're describing points to one set of problems that we could talk about as implementation, or we could talk about it in other ways. And I guess that sort of thing, and I'm saying this I'm stretching beyond my firm grounding here because I'm not a clinician and I'm not someone who develops or implements mental health interventions. But my sense is that things like that happen a whole hell of a lot,
Yes.
where you have a lot of really well-intentioned but misguided efforts to take an intervention model rooted in a certain understanding of human psychological processes and put them before people in ways that don't only risk failing, they really risk harming people
Mm-hmm.
by way of insult,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Because to come to people whose lives are really not on firm ground and they're riddled with uncertainty and they are not experiencing material security or stability, and probably their social networks and relationships are affected by all of those structural circumstances. And they're probably experiencing a lot of shame about their living circumstances. To come and say something like, well, buck up and be grateful is really, frankly, insulting and can cause harm. So I guess I'm trying to just sort of expand beyond just a recognition that sometimes, you need a square peg for a square hole and not a round peg for a square hole, to say like, it's more than just a mechanical problem.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah. And and then can I undo everything I've just said? And then again, please feel free to because it's like I do actually believe, and this is my belief, I guess, that everyone a more grateful version of everybody is a better version of themselves.
Mhm.
So, prisoners can find things to be grateful for. Now, I'm not saying they should be grateful. I'm
Mhm.
not pointing the finger to say if you're not feeling gratitude right now, that's your problem. You need to do this step-by-step thing that I'm going to instruct you how to do. I'm not saying that, but you can find things to be grateful for even in the most testing circumstances. Is that not also true?
I think that probably is true. And I want to offer another intervention by way of additional,
Yeah.
stuff to think with. Interventions that encourage people to be forgiving or to
Yep.
forgive. So I'm with you, on the gratitude piece. I think that there are obviously all sorts of implementation questions and challenges if you're working in a setting with incarcerated people who are experiencing incarceration, people who are incarcerated. You can do all sorts of amazing stuff if you're connecting, right? If
Yeah.
there's a relationship and a
Absolutely.
basis for framing the question and it's part of a process, right? So totally buy you on that count. Interventions designed to get people to forgive I think, are perhaps easier to see as potentially causing harm, because asking people to forgive when that's not what they are prepared for or what would allow them to experience healing from a wrong, a physical or emotional harm, that can be, in fact, even more dangerous and
Hmm.
harmful,
Hmm.
arguably. And I
Yeah.
think it's harder to make the same kind of, well, everybody can benefit. I mean, probably there is a similar argument to make there about how we all can benefit from choosing to forgive, but to try and impose an
Yeah.
expectation,
Yeah.
I think can really be quite dangerous and harmful.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm imagining like this is such a rich conversation. Like just it's almost like this framing of walking into a setting, whether it be, justice, homelessness or whatever it might be. And like it's almost like an anthropologist walks into a bar or something, but an anthropologist walks into a homeless shelter, let's say, or a positive psychologist walks in, or a whatever philosopher walks in. Like, what are they going to see? I would love. It's almost like there's different perspectives on the same problem, and I think we're mostly agreeing, but we see each other's limitations in their methods, and we just think in different ways. Like I'm kind of thinking in logic models, and
I'm thinking more in poetry in some respects. And I'm thinking in particular the book that kind of lit the fire for me in terms of the kind of anthropology I do is by an anthropologist called Robert Desjardins, who wrote a book about a homeless shelter.
really.
And yeah, and it's a beautiful book. And it's a book that was very interestingly written as part of a large federally funded study of homelessness and mental health in the United States.
Oh, I'd like to read
He's
this.
he's an anthropologist and a sort of literary-minded humanistic scholar. And he basically wrote a book that's a sort of, it's deeply ethnographic. and that it's trying to describe what he sees in the shelter and also account for and describe the experiences of the people he's getting to know in a way that couldn't be captured by any math, right? He talks about the the ways in which people experience the texture of walls of a building, the brutalist architecture, and how people living with serious mental illness experience the texture of walls. He's writing about the ways in which people who are experiencing serious mental illness experience time in ways that are very different from what many of us experience. So, yeah, our lens as anthropologists often pushes in directions that sit at an odd angle to other kinds of thinking and scholarship.
Yeah, thank you. And
We're really all over the place, aren't we?
we are, but I'm happy with that. I hope that that's working for you. My poor old questions, they just never really either I structure them in the wrong way because clearly we just jump around, or I'm just not a very good host, and I'm kind of
No,
fine
you're
with
a
both of
terrific
those.
host.
I'm happy with both of those answers, I think.
I'm
But
an obedient guest.
no, this has been fantastic, and I think it's really hopefully just shining a light on where we come from. I don't think we're here in this conversation to answer anything, but just to kind of bring these different perspectives together. And so I'm wondering whether we even answered the question basically, but this idea of the pitfalls of universalizing frameworks. I mean, I think we have covered that off. Is there anything else you wanted to say about that? So if I'm just covering it off, you're sort of saying you go to marginalized, you worked with marginalized communities in Tel Aviv, you are asking people about flourishing, and they're not listing back to you PERMA, right? They're not listing back to you RIF. They're coming with other sort of structural realities that they're facing. And so that's the pitfall, I guess, is that we're missing what it actually means to individuals. Does that cover off in a nutshell, or is there more to say?
Well, I think, in the empirical data that we published, that our team published, we're really saying it's not that the stuff that's in those models is irrelevant. Some appear to map better onto our data than others, but the kind of key take home we want to offer is that it sounds like from our findings, when you really talk to people, they're not going to run away from the material circumstances of their lives.
Yeah.
And suggest that they're divorced from the kinds of psychological dimensions of experience that are going to influence their capacity to experience well-being or not. That you need to be listening for those things, and you need to be thinking about them. And I would argue that they're relevant in clinical spaces and they're relevant in policy spaces, and that trying to push them away is both a methodological problem and also an ethical problem. And again, here I'm drawing on my training in public health, which really sees, and it's interesting. We write in our piece that just came out earlier this year, the piece that has the title that you like. We managed to look at the American Public Health Association's Code of Ethics, which actually invokes the language of flourishing, which I found super interesting, and really defines flourishing as when institutions and cultural structures create opportunities for people to realize a wide range of potential capabilities. And so from a public health standpoint, the mandate of the field is really to work toward creating a society in which systems and structures are going to support people's capacity to experience well-being. If we, it's really that braiding of the public health moral and ethical foundations and structural vision, together with the anthropological attention to subjective experience, in combination with the sorts of psychological questions and interventions that a tradition like positive psychology brings to the table, that I see as offering us a stronger fiber for creating social safety nets and thinking about building a society that can be supportive not just of those already living with privilege, but those who are not.
Yeah, thank you. And we've got 20 minutes left. I'm conscious of your time, so I'll limit it to two questions. I'll try and get us back on. I think we're actually back on track. I think I'm making it a bit overdramatic, but where I'd love to go from there is thinking about, what happens when these definitions of flourishing ignore these types of voices. And I'm
Mhm.
guessing like the context for this part of the question, I guess, is a selfish one in the sense that, our team have been working towards developing this taxonomy of positive mental health. We've asked experts from around the world, 122 from different disciplines. I think actually no anthropologists, so I apologize for that. About what we basically presented them a list of things that of dimensions that came from measures of well-being, pretty loosely defined to include kind of like resilience, coping, quality of life, and sort of the traditional mental well-being.
Mhm.
Now, our main goal, I think, is just to clarify the language in the field because it's so poor. All these terms are used so poorly. Now, the risk
Mhm.
is that we just reinforce these poor definitions. But at least in our mind, it's a step one or a version one of just
Mhm.
getting on the same page. We're not defining, which of these are universal. We're not defining which of these apply across non-weird countries. We're not talking about how to convert this into flourishing. For us, it's about setting the scene. But I guess I'm wondering, using that as an example, like what are the risks that, because in many ways, marginalized voices wouldn't have been included in any of this work. So what are the risks involved?
It's a good question. It's a little bit tricky to answer without seeing the list and right. And understand this is work in progress, not yet published.
Sure.
So I haven't had the
Sure,
ability.
sure, sure.
So,
Sorry.
yeah, no, it's fine. Just to note that it's a bit of a theoretical question. I would say, so 2 points I would raise. One is the question of, what's to be done with it,
Yeah.
right? Once this listing of 19 items exists or 19 criteria exists, what will the policy goals be in working with it? And maybe we could talk about that a little bit. The other point I would raise as a question, and this is where there's a joke about anthropologists that we're kind of like seagulls. We sort of fly in and we crap all over everything and then we fly out. Or in terms of kind of trying to pick apart the concepts, right?
Sure.
So, for instance, you mentioned resilience. There's a robust literature in anthropology that critiques the language of resilience and
Yeah.
says, well, what some have said, and this is work at the intersection of anthropology and Black feminist studies, for instance, that says the language of resilience is in fact damaging because it's expecting people to have the capacity to survive and thrive even when they should be doing something else, which is pushing back against oppressive structures, right? So even in just one concept like resilience, we can ask, well, what does that even mean? And is
Yeah.
that a healthy thing to aspire to or expect of people? And so one thing that I might do in looking at the list would be to sort of look at different items and say, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
And is
Yeah.
that something you really ought to be pushing for? And is its presence on the list a function of the fact that the folks you talk to
Mm.
are not representing ways of being in the world that are rooted in deep experiences of adversity? So that's one of the questions I might ask. But to go back to my first point or my first question, what sort of is the end game, and what is it that you and your colleagues are aspiring to do by doing this important?
Yeah, look, I think it's born from the need for some more consistency. Basically,
Hmm.
that's where it starts from. Of like, can we just agree on some terms,
Hmm.
basically, that are more or less relevant in the discussion around positive mental health. Stop
Hmm.
coming up with new terms. Stop conflating terms. Thinking of the jingle jangle kind of fallacy.
Hmm.
That's been the initial motivation. And where it goes from there, I think, is, where I feel like we're kind of building something up just to tear it down, but that's a useful process, and
Yeah.
I'm thinking that, we we included, because it did have more quality of life scales in there as well. It did ask about physical health, about sort of material stability, and those were actually voted out by the Delphi panel. Even when we tried our best to make it sound like this is not about your objective social status. This is about your perceived, personal circumstances. So
Interesting.
almost like to make it as psychological as it could sound. They also voted out, well, technically they just didn't vote it in, spirituality, which
Hmm.
I personally find quite an interesting question. It raises, like, goes to the heart of who gets to define flourishing, is the fact that spirituality was voted out. I think when you talked about, bringing a historical lens, I don't think you can talk about well, again, this isn't in the context of flourishing, but this idea of positive mental health or mental well-being without this quite consistent, not universal, but something like universal, a need for transcendence.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, I think for those listening, there's sort of an elephant in the room as we work through this particular piece, which is, of course, the fact that the van der Weel work is fundamentally pivoting around questions of flourishing and spirituality. So much so that, when we went through and counted the items in the Global Flourishing Study instrument focusing on flourishing, it was a very significant, not significant in a statistical sense, but
Yeah.
there were a lot. There's a lot in there on spirituality. And the study itself is really rooted in a certain set of assumptions about the relationship between engagement with spiritual beliefs and religious community and well-being or flourishing. And I'm very interested. I will be very interested in seeing how other scholars in the field respond to that. My sense, and this is sort of what we had in mind in writing our piece that's just come out earlier this year, is that perhaps it hasn't been as evident to folks leaning on the Human Flourishing Program work that religion is so fundamental to the kinds of questions they're asking and problems that they're addressing. Now, in a sense, it's kind of self-evident given where the funding is coming from. But one of our goals in writing that piece was really to say, it is quite interesting that the framing is deeply rooted, not just in an emphasis on spirituality, religious beliefs, and religious practice, but in a very particular understanding of a single religious tradition. A big one for sure, and a not insignificant denomination within
Sure.
Christianity, but like one religion, and the world is big. So, and one of the goals that we had in our piece was to say, it's quite interesting and important to think about the relationship between spirituality and flourishing. And it's quite another thing to design an instrument that's inquiring into people's experiences of spirituality and its relationship to flourishing when you are rooted in a particular normative
Yeah.
tradition.
Yeah.
So we can talk about that or not talk about it, but that's sort of my 2 cents on that piece. And I find it quite interesting that it's one of the things that weren't voted onto the island in developing
Yeah.
the.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think I would encourage people to read the paper because I think you do it so well there. Just trying to think. I think we've spoken about this offline a little bit, and I think we can just mention it and move on to the last question. But this idea that, one of the first guests I had on the show was someone called Fallon Goodman, and she recounted this experience basically of questioning PERMA basically and all the funny things that went on when she did that basically, and they're actually not that funny. But she did this response a couple of years later where I think it was called like something like questioning the juggernaut or something like that. And this idea that, basically like positive psychology has had a king. The king, I don't think of him as the king personally, but he's been kind of the king. You question the king, you get in trouble. And there's a concern, I think, that I've heard from lots of people from lots of different fields that the global flourishing study becomes the next juggernaut purely as a function of how big it is. It's kind of like too big to fail kind of idea. You're going to have all these people that work with the data that will be highly cited because they're sort of part of the team. They bring their way of looking at it, which, people will have more or less agreement with. And I think they welcome the disagreement, but it is this imbalance between, having the backing of all this data that's available, which is undeniably infused with a certain way of looking at the world, even if you look at it from a discipline perspective, let alone from a like theological perspective. And I think that's happy to leave it there basically, but happy to hear your comments.
Sure. No, I mean, my comment is a really simple one, which is that, as we were discussing near the top of our conversation, my colleagues and I put out our work, the 2022 collection, and then our more recent 2025 piece in response to the Human Flourishing Program's critique of our work, genuinely in the spirit of critical dialogue.
Yeah.
And so to those who are asking themselves where they ought to position their work in relation to that juggernaut, if that is indeed what is emerging, and I think you're quite right, take a look at what we're inviting people to think deeply about and see what you think.
Yeah.
And maybe you'll find some questions in there that are helpful to you in positioning yourself in relation to the study and the findings that are coming out. Because sometimes it's helpful just to have another another point to use in triangulating as we move forward in our own argumentation and critical scholarship. And so, I offer our critiques, and there are a couple of them, as potential points of orientation as people try to figure out where their work stands in relation to the ship that's moving on through
Yeah.
the seas in which we're all sailing.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm in your work and in this conversation, I'm so not seeing the sort of the seagull problem here. So this is good.
I try not to, but yeah.
Well, and like this is a thing, right? So I said, the Delphi work that we're doing, I know that it's not the final answer. It's a starting point, right? And so in many ways, we all are contributing the same error that we're possibly putting towards the global flourishing study, which is that I know that this is not the final answer. It has utility. I'm just going with it until we know more. In my Delphi, I just don't have $40 million to make it massive. Do you know what I mean? I hope that we go forward remembering that this is a study with certain assumptions that have limitations, and that we don't just forget those limitations as we go along. And it sounds like you're coming from that sort of similar position. And the fear is that if we now think of this as like, this is what flourishing now means, and these people are flourishing, these people aren't, forgetting the limitations that come with it, that we might be leading people astray. Is that a fair representation of the argument?
Absolutely. I think, to sort of give just a little bit more flesh to the account you're offering, I think it's appropriate at every point to ask these big questions. What do we mean by flourishing? Who is defining it? The terms. What are the stakes of defining things in this way as opposed to that way? What are the stakes of allowing ourselves to look at the scholarship that's emerging from this altitude as opposed to this altitude, right?
Mm.
Just to sort of ask ourselves, how is it we're orienting ourselves in relation to this conversation? And what assumptions are built into the definitions? What assumptions are built into the citation practices? How do we think about these larger questions of really what you could think of as the social studies of science or the social studies of knowledge production? How do they figure in the way work happens and the way scholarship unfolds? And I think the disposition that you're describing is spot on. And what we do in scholars as researchers, we develop a set of terms or concepts or theories, and then we test them out. And when they don't work for us, then we revise, we take critique into account, we adapt, we engage in robust, healthy, critical dialogue. And I have to say, and I was wondering if I would find myself compelled to get to this place at any point in our conversation or not, but I live in a society right now in which that kind of intellectual labor is not being valued, and in fact is being punished in some ways.
Mhm.
And I have a whole other set of research interests involving the kind of damage that's happening to our public health infrastructure as a result of what's happening in the United States at the level of the presidential administration right now, that is really trying to look at what happens to people as moral beings when they're told that science is not okay and should not any longer be part of what society supports and how policy is made. So what you're describing sounds to me like good science, and I think it's really important.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't know, that's so valuable.
Your
And
word.
no,
I
I
did.
no, that's perfect. It's I think it's hard to look from the outside and talk about what happens in the US because you're living it a little bit, but well, a lot. But I just want to make sure, like, I'm wondering, like, I think if I'm understanding this correctly, I think is it fair to say that your biggest concern with whichever way you measure is that if you misinterpret the data because you're overlooking the limitations of the way it was collected, that's your biggest problem with the field. Is that's what I'm possibly hearing? And maybe I don't want to necessarily just boil it down to one thing, but I think, for example, like I would say, if we use Corey Keyes's work and we go, and it's been published already, marginalized community. He's worked in marginalized communities. Seeing that some people are able to flourish in those circumstances despite structural limitations, it's what you then do with that research the way that you set policy on the back of it or practice as a clinician on the back of it, that is your major concern, would you say?
Hmm.
Like it's almost like you're sort of saying, sorry, I know you're about to answer, but measure it how you want in a sense, but be very cognizant of the limitations that come with your measurement. Or is that unfair?
I would take a step back and
Yeah.
say, what are you measuring?
Uh-huh.
I think the concerns come up not in the data. That's late. I think they come up at the level of instrument design and measurement and
Okay.
conceptualization. Because, for instance, you can come up with data that shows that people, who are living in poor communities that have experienced racism across generations and that live in spaces that have faced environmental neglect and all sorts of toxic pollutants in the environment, nonetheless are able to flourish. Well, then what sort of policy conclusions or
Yeah.
recommendations come out of that? It might be, well, you just have to find the people who are able to flourish and figure out what they're doing and then try and make everybody else do it. And I think that's really dangerous. I think it's quite pernicious. I think the larger question is, in what ways might our discipline itself be blinding us to the more important questions?
Yeah.
And in the case I'm describing, a more important question is, what can we do at a policy or public health level in order to, at very least, recognize and at most rectify the larger circumstances that are going to impinge upon the ways in which community members are or are not able to pursue their own opportunities to flourish or
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
Does
Yeah.
that help? Does
Perfect.
that
It does. Yeah. Yeah. And sorry for probably asking the same question a million times, but it's
no?
really, I hope that it's definitely coming through clearly to me. I hope that the audience is getting it as well. Do you have 10 more minutes so we could go into languishing?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And obviously feel free to say no, because I think that's where that's the natural next step basically in terms of what you just said is, what I'm thinking, or just having another close read of Frank Martella's paper on his sort of theory of well-being, trying again, I think, to clarify the field. I don't know if you've come across that one before, but he says it's like in the last paragraph or something on the second to last page. He talks about averages,
Mhm.
and basically does it help us to understand that Australia is a 7.8 and America is a 7.9? Does that
Mhm.
help us? Possibly not that much. Might be more fruitful is thinking about minimums, basically. What
Mm.
is an acceptable, like I'm probably, he used more subtle language than this, but basically what's an acceptable
Mm.
bottoming out, basically. So, almost like a poverty line of well-being. Where do we, is that more fruitful to think? So in that conversation, so say using your analogy, or your example, we go into a low SES community. One option is we ask all the flourishers and see what they're all up to. The other
Mhm.
option is we ask all the languishers and see what's going on for them. You will come up with, like you say, very different policy recommendations on the back of doing those two
Mhm.
options. But getting
Mhm.
to the bottom of, what can a policy, what can we do politically, try our best to remove the obstacles to flourishing, but the things that are driving people under the well-being poverty line.
Mhm.
Is that Does that
Hmm.
kind of make sense in your world? Am I already making again my own assumptions to fill in the gaps here?
Yeah, no, it's so interesting what you're saying, and it in part because um it's such a different model from the way I'm
Yeah.
accustomed to. So, for instance, when I think like uh, so the piece that I think you're referring to is a piece I wrote about languishing. It's based on another project that we haven't talked about today called the Pandemic Journaling Project. So when the pandemic began in spring of 2020, a colleague at Brown University, Kate Mason, and I developed an online journaling platform where people could take a couple minutes a week to chronicle the impact of the pandemic in their lives. And something very interesting happened after Adam Grant's piece on languishing came out in the New York Times, in that we saw people begin to talk about their experiences languishing. So we saw how a scholarly term moved into public discourse and then moved into the vernacular. And so that piece is looking at what happens when a scholarly concept sort of follows that kind of trajectory and becomes I talk about it as a cultural resource. So the concept of languishing became something that people could use to frame and name and understand their own experience, which is, not unique. Stuff like that happens all the time. And I cite some other work by medical and psychological anthropologists looking at depression in Iran and looking at neurasthenia and looking at other mental health diagnoses and concepts that take on a life of their own, like quite literally a life of their own, that becomes that really diverges from what these concepts mean in clinical settings. So that's what I'm doing in that piece. I'm kind of tracing what happens to the idea of languishing. So that's sort of the piece. Now, back to your question, I think one of the things I do is push back on the idea that people can be categorized as flourishers and languishers. I
Okay.
think there's sort of reductive and problematic about that. And certainly from a clinical or a therapeutic standpoint, pretty dangerous to be like, well, you're a languisher, right? You're a flourisher, you're a languisher. I think, there's harm that can be done by categorizing people in that way. Again, recognizing that's probably not the way in which that categorization typically operates. It's more research
Yeah.
classification as
Yeah.
opposed to a full classification. Anyway, so when I think about the model you're putting forth, when I think like what would the lowest, I'm thinking about the sort of concatenation of circumstances that would lead someone to be languishing in a situation of adversity like the one I've described. So community of color, low socioeconomic status, facing, patterns of toxic environmental exposures over a period of time, intergenerational trauma. Like what that already is a lot. And then let's say you add in an adverse childhood experience or two, or you add in a traumatic experience like interpersonal violence. How much of that added adversity is tolerable? Or, now maybe people could face all of that adversity and flourish. It's just hard for me to think myself into an answer to your question because my policy brain goes to, well, fix the freaking problems, not set a bar and then say, well, it's okay for you, it's okay for you to suffer that much. But more than that is a problem. And in part, and here's another sort of anthropological intervention, just the
Sure.
setting of a bar involves certain kinds of moral judgment.
Yeah.
And who's to set that bar, right? Who's to do that moral work of deciding, well, this much languishing is, all right, we can tolerate it. Below that, now we've crossed a line. Now we have a moral or a policy imperative to act. So I have trouble with the scenario and the question.
Sure. Sure.
Which
But
is
this is so valuable.
not a satisfying answer, but it's the best I can offer.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. And it is, I think you're just showing me how many blind spots there are in these different fields. This imperative, if I said at the start, that clinicians have this imperative to act, to do something, to provide hope, to provide treatment, to be the superhero, as you said. This, like, there's a public policy version of that.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing that now, I think, which is really interesting. So, I don't know what to do about any of this.
That anthropologists can muck up the works. But, I think what I would offer as we move to close, I think the kinds of questions and the kind of critiques that my discipline offers, and I feel like in some respects I'm really trying to bring this sensibility to your audience, is to ask some of these hard questions and to think about the intersections of the conceptual and the practical, and to think about the ways in which moral judgment and moral assessment inevitably will figure into the intellectual work that we do as scholars. So, we do ourselves all a favor if we open our eyes to these kinds of difficult, messy dimensions of the work that we do and sit with the messiness a bit and, maybe even bring in an anthropologist to help us sort of think it through on occasion.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. This has been really, really valuable. I have to probably rewatch this a couple of times to get my head around it, I'm sure. But I really appreciate this. I mean, I haven't asked, like, how has the reception been to your work? Particularly around flourishing. Have you had feedback from people saying, like, keep going, this is great, or has it just been kind of silent?
Yeah, no, there's I've been in touch with a number of people around the world. Some are folks in policy spaces, some are clinicians. One is a philosopher, so Ariamon Batten O'Malley, whom
Yeah.
we've had as guests in the past. So there are a number of people in different fields who've expressed some interest in the work I'm doing, and we've had some really lovely conversations. I'm beginning some work with a terrific clinician in the UK, a clinician and clinician educator named Louise Uni, whom you might want to speak with at one
Yeah.
point, who's interested in clinician burnout and the ways in which the training of physicians itself is a problem within the healthcare system, specifically in the UK, but I think that there are broader implications. And so she and I have thought a lot about the relationship between efforts to promote flourishing and what she describes as creative inquiry, or where she brings the humanities and the arts into medical education to try and get clinicians thinking with other parts of their brain and other parts of themselves as they try and figure out how to be the kinds of clinicians who are going to be able to support holistic well-being in their patients and also protect themselves from burnout. So, these are just a few of the folks that I've had the opportunity to be in conversation with in response to the work we've done on flourishing. And I look forward to seeing where things go moving forward.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. So again, thank you so much for your time. My final comment, I guess, is I'm wondering whether just flourishing as a concept is just too big, and that it's too unwieldy. I'm thinking about, if we started with the example of like, 10,000 steps, that as a bar that's set. If we want to talk about this idea of setting a bar, that's a much more discrete thing to think about, probably with as much complexity in a sense, but a bit more straightforward. And it's like, I wonder if we thought our way through some of these questions just on something as simple as get 10,000 steps. Where does that number come from? Why does it come from there? What do we do about it? So on and so forth. That at least we could have get the sort of the theory out of the way before we then complicate it by something as contextual as human flourishing.
Yeah, it's an interesting analogy. Yeah. I could say lots more on that, but I think you
Yeah.
want to wrap us up.
Again, thank you so much. And where can people find you? Are you on social media? What are you up to with that?
Yeah. So first, thank you so much for having me. I ditched X for all the reasons. I'm on Blue Sky, not super active, but I write stuff and I've got a couple pieces coming out in the near future. So I'm always happy to be in touch by email. So
Very
thanks again
cool.
for having me.
No, my pleasure. And thanks again.
Most welcome.